Welcome everyone to ADEA's webinar on unpacking the budget resolution. And there is certainly a lot to unpack, and I'm excited about this session. We have, I think, two of the uh, foremost experts on this topic on the planet with us today, and I will briefly introduce them and then let them go at it because nobody tuned in to listen to me. Our first speaker will be Bill Dauster, who is a lawyer, economist, speechwriter, lecturer who has worked in the Senate or at the White House since 1986. I knew him best as the chief counsel of the Senate Budget Committee some years ago. He also served as the Deputy Chief of Staff to the Majority Leader for Policy. He literally wrote the book on the budget resolution, which I have an old copy here that is well worn, I assure you. He has a master's degree in economics from the University of Southern California and a JD from the Columbia Law School. Our other speaker is John Fansmith, who is the Senior Vice President for Government Relations and National Engagement at the American Council on Education. He is also an author, having written for the Washington Post, the Journal of College and University Law, and quoted many times in countless articles and publications. John has an undergrad degree from the Georgetown University and a master's in history from the Johns Hopkins University. These are two of the best people on the subjects of budget resolutions and higher education that I think you'll find anywhere in this city and probably in this country. With that, Bill, I'll sort of turn it over to you, and you can share your screen and tell us all about it.
Reconciliation, most people will think of, when they think of reconciliation, they think about the act or the state of bringing about friendship or harmony. That is not what we're talking about today. We're talking about money and power. So this is different from that kind of reconciliation. This has its roots back in the last presidential constitutional crisis with President Nixon. And you may remember him with the Watergate crisis. But he was also famous for impounding, refusing to spend appropriated money. And Sam Ervin, who was the chair of the Watergate Committee, was also very concerned about the power of the purse and what was happening with Nixon there. So Ervin introduced the first version of the Congressional Budget Act that was then enacted in 1974. And what's different about that is that the budget resolution and the reconciliation are both highly privileged. That means that there's limited time for them to be considered, and that leads to a majority vote in the end. Now, that's not unusual in the House of Representatives, but in the United States Senate, as your House member once said, in the Senate, you cannot go to the bathroom without 60 votes. So it's unusual to get around the filibuster in the United States Senate. So think about budget reconciliation, the budget process, as a workaround the filibuster in the United States Senate. Why is that important? Because we're more and more a government of separation of parties, not just powers, as these two NYU professors said. Here's a graph that shows that when Tim and I were in the business way back when, you could see a great deal of overlap between the blue senators and the red senators. Half of each caucus is to the middle side of their more extreme members. But we've gradually gone to our separate corners. Here's where we look at today based on GovTrack's representation. You can see the overlap is very, very small. You've heard about some of these folks. But even if you can get all the people in the middle together, remember you need 60 votes. So you need to get 7 for the majority, get 7 of the Democrats, and that's a hard task to do to get all 7 of those the Democratic leader is keeping all the Democrats together. So that means that more and more legislation gets done through broad consensus agreement. And that means things like the annual defense bill, where you get 87 votes for something. And that means that the two leaders have negotiated what's going to happen on behalf of their caucuses. And often means you have to get the four corners, the House Speaker and the Democratic leader there too, on any piece of legislation. That's not easy. That means that we've been getting fewer and fewer laws enacted over the past half century. We've probably set a record in the last century for how few public laws were enacted in the last Congress. That means that the laws end up to be sort of like this, small potatoes. For example, in the last Congress, there was the Duck Stamp Modernization Act. Now, those of you who know duck stamps, this is important, but if you're going to shoot down ducks out of the sky, you apparently need a duck stamp, and now you can get one virtually instead of just in paper form. But that doesn't allow you to do important things like to figure out whether to do something about air quality or climate change, because as you can see, the parties are very polarized about whether that's really an issue or not. Now, take that polarization, and layer it on top of what these guys did in the Constitution. They require it, therefore, the two things together mean that you have to have a trifecta, the first three horses. You have to bet on all three of those. Where I used to work for a Nevada center, you have to get cherries on it, all three slot machine windows. What do I mean? You have to get the House, the Senate, and the White House to get anything done in government these days. Now, this shows you in the last half century, last 50 years, who's been in charge of the House, who's been in charge of the Senate, who's been in charge of the presidency. As you can see, sometimes Democrats had that trifecta, sometimes Republicans had that trifecta, but it's really only about 1 in 3 times when you have a unified government, a government that is all together in a partisan way, and half those times it's the wrong people in charge. You can decide which was the wrong people. And so it ends up being, as President Obama said to Jerry Seinfeld, what sport best describes it? It's like football because every once in a while you see an opening. Now, these guys have the trifecta now. These are their official photos. I'm not doctoring anything here. So they get to use the reconciliation process. What is reconciliation? I'd say it's the thing that in the last quarter century has ended up with the most important economic bills, apart from Tim's stuff, the appropriations. If you're not appropriations, these are the big economic bills in the last quarter century. The starting gun for that is the budget resolution. A budget resolution is a concurrent resolution, means it gets passed by both houses of Congress, but not signed by the president. Rules for the Congress. And then pursuant to that budget resolution, you can enact a law, and that's the reconciliation bill. Now, a budget resolution takes you 50 hours on the floor in the Senate, plus a votorama. A votorama is what could be a potentially unlimited number of votes on amendments. Why is amendments an interesting thing? Well, it used to be when Tim and I started in this business, amendments were most of what the votes were in the Senate, that gray part of the chart, that chart here, and bills along that. So most of it was legislation. Now, mostly 2/3 of what we do is nominations, and it's a rare time we do amendments. So that yellow part, doing amendments in the budget resolution, is a big deal that the majority party doesn't want to have to do, the minority party does want to do. So having the amendment votes is a cost the majority party has to pay. So you get that votorama and 50 hours on the floor, and you get a reconciliation bill. It itself has 20 hours on the floor. Because it's a majority vote thing, the result of that reconciliation bill, what's in that reconciliation bill, gets determined in the caucus for the majority party. They always meet in this room, the Mansfield room in the Capitol in the Senate. So there are 53 Republicans in the majority. That means they can afford to lose these 3 senators. And if they do lose these 3, then the next 3 senators, each of them becomes king. On the House side, it's even closer, 220, 215. They are at the closest possible margin. And that means every one of the House members is like Joe Manchin was in the last Senate. In the last year, they get to, every member can be a deciding member. Now, that's important when it comes to things like salt. What I mean, salt, I mean state and local tax deductions. And if you're a Republican congressman from California or New York or New Jersey, state deduction, the deduction of state taxation is an important thing. And then on the other side of the ledger in the House, there are deficit hawks shown here. They're concerned about this exploding debt that we have. On the Senate side, Rand Paul would be like that. He's saying, I don't want to do a debt limit extension in a reconciliation bill. So I don't think we get Rand Paul's vote for the majority in this reconciliation bill. Then there's people who have jobs who came out of the Inflation Reduction Act, energy jobs. That's pretty much every senator is going to have some jobs from that. So these four Republican senators say, hey, be careful about cutting those energy tax credits. Then there's Medicaid. These six senators said, well, don't make too deep cuts in Medicaid because a lot of my constituents are relying on that healthcare program. So the concurrent resolution on the budget is sort of the invitation to the dance for this reconciliation process. And it decides whether you get to dance or not. Here's the invitation to the Armed Services Committee, for example. Now, as George Orwell wrote in his book, all committees are equal, but some committees are more equal than others. So the Finance Committee, which has this much spending authority, it's definitely going to get invited. Some of the other committees on the right there might not get invited. And then the House, similarly, Concentrated Ways and Means and Energy and Commerce. Those are the committees to keep an eye on in particular. Here are the folks that did get invited by the budget resolution on the House side. Now, as you can see here, the biggest number is you invite those Ways and Means folks because that's the tax cut. You definitely want to get those tax cuts in there. That's what is driving this bill in the main part for the Republican caucus. The next biggest number is the Energy and Commerce Committee. They've been instructed to come up with $880 billion in deficit reduction. That's going to have to, that's why we're talking about Medicaid, because that's the big thing in their jurisdiction. And as you can see from this chart, Medicaid, most of the benefits, the dollars of Medicaid go to folks with disabilities or folks of my age, elderly folks. So that's become a sensitive matter in the House side. Now, on the Senate side, the instructions aren't the same. It's sort of unusual. There are different instructions to the House and the Senate side. Senate side, the biggest number, once again, is the tax cuts. And then the second biggest numbers are about border security and armed services, about military defense. There's a big question mark in the Senate side about how much deficit reduction you're going to be doing. So if you compare what the House says and the Senate says, you've got about $3 trillion worth of difference between the two instructions to the for two different sides. So there's a lot of differences they have to work out between the two houses. In other words, they sort of punted some of the big decisions to the reconciliation bill, working out between the two of them. The other thing that the budget resolution does is it looks at the calendar. And so the Republicans, the Speaker, would love to get the calendar done in the next couple of months. Now, in past reconciliation bills, there have been two reconciliation bills that got done in that first one. This in the Republican caucus, a Republican trifecta. Then when the Democrats had the trifecta, we did two bills as well. But the president wants one powerful, one beautiful bill, he says. That means that they're focusing on trying to get it all done in the next couple of months. Well, maybe in the next 3 months, or maybe into the next 4 months. But they really want to get it done before the August recess if they can. I'll return to why on that. Now, the thing that constrains what you can stuff into this package is a thing called the Byrd Rule, named after Senator Robert C. That makes everybody in the minority party into a Byrd soldier. They want to apply the Byrd Rule and to constrain what can be put into that bill. The Byrd Rule has 6 parts, and I'll go through them real quick. And this is what you cannot do in this reconciliation process. Thing one, you have to have something that affects outlays or revenues, or else it cannot be in the reconciliation bill. It has to be budgetary. So you have to get the Congressional Budget Office or the Joint Committee on Taxation to say it has a budgetary effect. Thing two, You got to comply with that budget resolution, with what the budget committee said you could do with the instructions in the budget resolution. The budget resolution instructions are only about spending, revenue, or statutory debt limit, or combination of those things. And this is an example. This is the instruction to the finance committee of what they can do. They can increase the deficit by not more than $1.5 trillion over the period. For deficit increases, those instructions, so for tax cuts or spending increases, those instructions are a ceiling. That's the most that they can do. Here's the example to the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. They're instructed to reduce the deficit by not less than $1 billion in that period. And for deficit reduction instructions, for tax increases or spending cuts, like the Health Committee there has, or the Energy and Commerce Committee has on Medicaid, that's a floor on what they can do. They have to do more than that to comply in the Senate. There's also a provision for the statutory limit on the debt. Here's that. It says you can increase the debt limit, your finance committee, by no more than $5 trillion. Why is that important? Because the Congressional Budget Office tells us we're going to have to do that by August or September. The Treasury Secretary, maybe this week, will tell us when the real deadline is, and that could be the deadline for when the reconciliation bill has to really get done. So in the next maybe 3.5 months to get this thing done. Third thing, the Byrd Rule says, you got to stay within your jurisdiction. So instruction to the Health Committee, the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, you've got to stay within that committee. Got to color within the lines, better than this people did. So I work for the Environment and Public Works Committee. If a bill has been referred to me, that doesn't mean I can necessarily do that bill in reconciliation. A bill gets referred to me based on what predominates in that bill. So that if it's the majority of the bill, it comes to me, or the green part. If the plurality is green, it comes to the Environment Committee. But in reconciliation, every provision has to be within the jurisdiction of the reporting committees that have been invited. And so anything within any other committee's jurisdiction is subject to being stricken out. Fourth part of the Byrd Rule says you can't put anything in there where the budgetary stuff is, quote, merely incidental to the non-budgetary, the policy stuff. That's obviously a judgment call. So who's making the judgment here? The parliamentarian, this young lady, is going to make a decision in what one House leader once said. She has a seance with a guy who's been dead for 13 years now, meaning Senator Byrd. That's not actually what happens. No, she has what is called a Byrd bath, which is sort of a quasi-judicial proceeding where we put in memoranda that argues our case. We argue before her, like before a judge or the Supreme Court. Here's why we think it should be or shouldn't be in the Byrd, in the reconciliation bill, and then she rules. And that's the final word, unless you get 60 votes over to waive the Byrd Rule. If you can't get around it, then your provision becomes a Byrd dropping, and it gets dropped out of the bill. That's the final word, unless the majority leader persuades the parliamentarian. Here's Majority Leader Lyndon Baines Johnson persuading the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee on a matter. Why is persuasion important? Because the majority leader can change who's the parliamentarian. That's happened 3 times where these two guys, 2 of the times, switched jobs over whether they were parliamentarian or not. Now, some House people have been floating maybe why don't we hire a new parliamentarian? But Majority Leader Thune says, no, we don't want to overrule the parliamentarian. Third way that you get around the parliamentarian is you can fib about the numbers. And Lindsey Graham's been talking about that. He's the chair of the Budget Committee. He's been saying, I'm going to tell numbers that are different from what parliamentarian hears from CBO. So what's at issue here is that the Senate Republicans are talking about the dark part not even counting. Continuing the existing tax cuts don't count, and only the light pink part counts, whereas the House is thinking all of those things count. Another source of differences between the House and the Senate. Fourth way you might get around the parliamentarian is because the parliamentarian, the lady in the blonde there, hair there, advises the person sitting in the big chair in the middle. And the big person in the big chair in the middle, he doesn't have to do everything the parliamentarian says. The presiding officer almost always does, but there's a lot of chatter now about ignoring the parliamentarian. So here's a recent headline where the headline says they're talking about bypassing the parliamentarian. You read the story and they say, no, we're not going to overrule her, but it sounds like there's a lot of discussion these days about whether to pay attention to the parliamentarian or not. Fifth is you can appeal the ruling of the chair, but that takes 60 votes too. And finally, there's what people call the nuclear option with a determined majority in the Senate. Since 2013, you can always get to a simple majority vote if you're willing to overturn the precedents of the Senate. Returning back to the Byrd rule, the fifth constraint of the Byrd rule is you cannot increase the deficit in those years beyond those covered by the budget resolution, usually 10 years. So that's why the old 2017 Trump tax cuts were only in effect for this 10-year period, and we have to renew them now because they were complying with the Byrd rule. Question whether this provision is going to be paid attention to. Finally, the sixth part of the Byrd rule says that you cannot change Social Security. You cannot change the taxes or the benefits of the Social Security program. But in 1993, we changed the taxation of Social Security because taxation is good for Social Security or is good for reconciliation, but Social Security is not good for reconciliation. So you can tell that this gets very complicated, and that's why people like me can continue to have jobs 40 years into this business and still have to talk about what's in reconciliation. Here's hoping that all of your encounters with reconciliation involve merely the friendship and harmony stuff and settling and resolving, and that it's always a good thing when you hear the words reconciliation. So that's my part of the reconciliation bill. Now John has to do all the hard part. I've done the easy part.
Thank you very much, Bill. It was kind of a trip down memory lane for me, but I appreciate it. And John, I want to turn to you now. I know you've forgotten more about higher education than I'll ever know. So please tell us what this all means for our programs and institutions.
Yeah, and thanks, Tim. And I'll say, Bill, hard act to follow. I don't think I've ever seen anyone who's made reconciliation been that informative while being that amusing at the same time. That is a tough process to work through with an audience. So everyone can see what I have up there. I'm going to focus, as Tim shared, really on what are the higher education provisions that are in the current reconciliation process. And to start, it's worth saying higher education is very much a central focus of this reconciliation package. And that's really both a direct focus, as we've seen in bills at the education committees, the Education Workforce Committee in the House and the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee in the Senate. And then indirectly, because as we'll talk about, things like Medicaid, even if the policy changes aren't really thought about in terms of higher education, those changes that are being considered might have a massive impact on colleges, universities, both their students and their finances. And then the other thing I would just sort of highlight as we think about what's at risk for higher education reconciliation process is the House versus Senate differences that Bill did such a great job of covering. But primarily, I would focus on those differences in terms of where the cuts are being required of the committees. You know, Bill talked about the committees with the biggest instructions as part of the reconciliation process. And one thing you noticed when he did that was on both sides, both chambers, the education committees are among the committees that have to find savings, not the committees that are getting money to spend, which means very much education programs are targeted for cuts, not areas of increase. And based on what we've seen so far, I think we have a pretty good sense of what those cuts are going to look like. I will spend a lot of time talking about what we have seen from the House, and that's because the House has actually given us numbers so far. The Education Workforce Committee marked up, they considered their bill and passed it out of committee last week. And as Bill showed, they were instructed to find at least $330 billion in savings from programs in their jurisdiction. They actually exceeded that number. They identified $351 billion in spending cuts. And they did that by including a package of things that changes really a lot of pretty core fundamental areas of financing higher education. Both from aid and loans offered on the front end to the terms of repayment and repayment plans on the back end. And so I'll walk through all of those. I'm going to start with Pell Grants and financial aid. I know not necessarily directly relevant to dental educators, but huge changes in this area that have gotten a lot of attention within the higher education community. And what the committee did, they had three areas of focus there. The first was they extended eligibility to short-term programs, think of certificate programs or job training programs that previously had not been eligible for Pell Grants. This was basically the inclusion of a bill that the House Education Committee had passed on a bipartisan basis last Congress called the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act. That was a bill very popular among obviously both sides. It's been a popular policy idea in Congress for a while now. So the inclusion of that, at least my organization, AC, thinks is a very good thing. The other things they've done on Pell are a little bit more of a mixed bag. The Pell Grant program has a very complicated funding formula. It's a combination of funding from a variety of sources. It's forward funded, so Congress every year is trying to guess how much that program will need in the following academic year and provide for it. And as a result, sometimes they provide more than enough money. Sometimes Congress provides less money than is needed. What we have seen because of growth in that program is that previous funding is not enough, and the program is going to run into what's called a shortfall. Essentially, Pell would be about $3 billion, a little less, short of the money needed to meet the needs and the terms of the program. The good news is that Congress addressed that shortfall, and they did part of that by funding about $10 billion in new funding in the House's reconciliation bill to take care of the shortfall problem. The flip side of that, which was much more problematic, is that they made a number of eligibility changes that also made the program less expensive, but therefore less generous as well. They raised what the threshold for a full-time student is from 12 to 15 credits per semester, which also raised the floor for a half-time student. Pell recipients get paid out based on their enrollment intensity, so you get essentially half of a Pell Grant for half-time, full Pell Grant for full-time, varying levels based on your income profile. But they also eliminated from eligibility students who were enrolled less than half-time. So moved the floor higher for all students to be qualified and eliminated a bunch of students who are at the bottom end of that spectrum. This will have a very disproportionate impact on especially working students and adult students who tend to enroll at lower levels because they have other obligations in their lives they have to balance. Think about students at community colleges, at open access four-year institutions. Those students who often have the fewest resources to afford higher education are the ones who are going to be hardest hit. The loan side, though, is where the biggest changes have occurred, and they will have a very big impact on graduate education if they are to be enacted. Again, this is the House's proposal, and I'll talk a little bit about where the Senate stands on some of these things, but the House bill would fundamentally reshape the federal student lending system we have now. It would create a new structure around loans, in part by doing things like eliminating the Grad Plus lending program, substantially limiting the Parent Plus lending program at the federal level, and then looking at consolidating the approximately 13 different repayment plans that currently exist into 2 different repayment plans for borrowers entering repayment. They would also change the limits that students could borrow on an annual and on a cumulative basis. And this is one area where, especially for dental education, I think it's important to note. As I mentioned, they would get rid of Grad Plus lending. They would also institute new aggregate caps on overall lending of $50,000 for undergraduate borrowing, which is either an increase or a decrease, depending on what type of student you are currently. They would limit aggregate borrowing for what they call graduate students, think students in master's programs, to $100,000 across their lifetime. And then for what they call professional students, and this would be dentists, this would be doctors, lawyers, MBA programs, that would be capped at $150,000 lifetime. So a $200,000 max when you include $50,000 for undergrad and $150,000 for graduate, but no exemption for the health professions. So students who would need to borrow above $200,000 across their undergraduate and graduate level program would need to borrow outside of federal lending. They would need to go into the private marketplace. The other thing they have done is they've changed the annual loan limits. Previously, certainly under Grad Plus, graduate students could borrow up to the cost of attendance. Now the borrowing limit is set at the median cost of attendance minus, including basically the net price plus cost of attendance for the median of that program. So a BA in history program, they would find the median cost of attendance nationally for that, and that would be the maximum any student could borrow regardless of where they went to school. So for 50.1% of programs, those BA in history programs, they would be able to borrow up to their cost of attendance to participate. For the other half of programs, they would have some unmet need that couldn't be captured in federal student borrowing. All of these changes have actually combined to make the programs less generous, both in terms of the aid up front. For instance, for undergraduate student borrowing, subsidized loans for low-income students where the government pays your interest while you're studying would be eliminated. And then these loan repayment plans on the back end would also be less generous. I started by talking about the committee had to find $330 billion in savings. Those savings are a direct result of less money going out from the federal government to students, to institutions, and to borrowers. When you make $351 billion in cuts like the House has proposed, that's $351 billion less going out to students, institutions, and borrowers. So these are less generous proposals than what are currently on the books. Finally, in the area of loans, they include a new concept of risk-sharing payments on institutions. And this is one that's been around for a while in various forms in Congress. It's sort of a popular idea because it seems relatively simple. Make schools pay for the outcomes of their students. The formula in the bill is very, very complicated. I won't go into all the details if people care. We can talk about that in questions. But the net effect is that about $1.8 billion a year would need to be paid back to the federal government over the next 10 years under their risk-sharing plan. If you look at the House Republicans on the Education and Workforce Committee who are proposing this, they have numbers up on their website. According to their numbers, 90% of all institutions would wind up paying a risk-sharing penalty. And even when you offset that penalty with some grants they provide for schools that meet certain terms and agree to do certain things, mostly holding tuition levels fixed for a student's time, 75% of schools come out net negative, losing money under this proposal. So it is not a very narrowly targeted proposal. It would put a big burden on institutions. Those calculations are determined at the programmatic level, and maybe even more troubling, especially for schools that may not have be highly resourced. You are given your score by the government during your academic year. You have 3 months to make your payment. If you don't make that payment, then new penalties accrue, leading up to possibly losing Title IV eligibility. So it is a very problematic approach that was going to cause a lot of uncertainty for institutions. There's a couple other places where higher education is impacted, and especially in the tax space. The one that gets talked the most about, almost ironically, probably only impacts a very, very small number of institutions. In the 2017 Trump tax cuts that were passed as a reconciliation package, they created something called the endowment tax. This would tax institutions based on the size of their endowments. The eligibility threshold for it that was created in 2017 was essentially divide the number of students you have by your endowment assets. If that number is more than $500,000 per student, you are subject to a 1.4% tax on those assets. If you are below that threshold, you don't pay the tax. Currently, about 40 to 50 institutions pay that tax annually. It depends on how their endowments are doing and what their student populations are. It is almost certain that tax will be increased this year, and it will be increased in a couple different ways. One is that 1.4% tax is going to go up, likely way up. The numbers you hear most often are either 14% or 21%. 21% would match the corporate tax rate. 14% seems to be one we hear most often these days, but that's a tenfold increase in the current tax level. The other thing that is likely to happen in this area is that currently international students at institutions are part of that student calculation. So when a school is dividing their endowment by their students, they include their international students as part of that pool. It is highly likely, especially because certain institutions have gotten a lot of attention recently, that do not pay the endowment tax. That is a result of having large international student populations, that international students will be excluded from that calculation. So more schools will be included under the tax if that goes forward. And again, those schools will be paying a much higher level. Two other things in the tax space where we are hoping actually for changes to the good of students would be repealing the taxability of Pell and other scholarship aid. A lot of people are surprised to learn that that's taxable, but for students, and Pell's case low-income students, but for other students, scholarship aid they're awarded is seen as a form of income, and they have to pay a tax on that. That has been on the books for a while. Doesn't make a lot of sense that a federal need-based benefit could add to your tax burden. But that is one thing that I think there's a lot of bipartisan interest in getting rid of. There's been come close over the last few years. This might be a place where we see that. Also, Section 127, employer reimbursement plans for educational expenses. Those are also bipartisanly popular. There's an interest in raising the limit on those and encouraging employers to adopt those. So those would be things that we would be supportive of that have some chance of being included. Again, may not offset entirely the endowment tax increases, but things to be optimistic about. And then finally, I started by talking about the direct and indirect impact on higher education. And Medicaid really is the biggest one when we think about this. As Bill talked about, the Energy and Commerce Committee in the House, they were instructed to find $880 billion in savings from programs under their jurisdiction. As the Congressional Budget Office has said, that is basically limits them almost exclusively to changes to the Medicaid program, which is a huge program, part of the reason why they could find those savings there. But because it is a huge program, it has a big impact on higher education. And it's not one we often think about in higher education as sort of a central issue for us, but about 3.4 million post-secondary students are on Medicaid. That's their primary source of healthcare. It's about 17% of all college and university students in this country. So a massive pool of students who rely on Medicaid for their healthcare. Changes in eligibility, especially as college students tend to skew younger. Discussions have been about younger participants maybe being having their eligibility changed or limited. That would have a big impact on those students and on our institutions. In addition, a lot of the other proposals would be to limit the amount of federal matching of state funds or to change the terms under which funds for Medicaid are awarded to states. As we have seen again and again in the past, when state funding sources are reduced, they tend to turn to higher education as a revenue raiser. Institutions can raise tuition, things like K-12 and law enforcement and healthcare spending. They don't have similar funding streams that are attached. So what we tend to see is the biggest cuts in higher education accompany large cuts in federal resources. And as a result, tuitions go up, institutions are cutting back. Then finally, because a lot of colleges and universities operate hospitals and hospital systems, often in particular in rural areas, the only operating hospital systems that serve a large number of Medicaid eligible populations. Any cuts to the reimbursement for servicing those individuals, as well as cuts to research and other supports that are provided through Medicaid to hospitals, will again have a big impact on colleges and universities, their revenue, their bottom line, in ways that, again, not a lot of people think about in the Medicaid discussion. We are kind of an ancillary target within this overall approach. Now, a lot of what I've talked about relates to what the House has put forward. It is worth repeating that the difference between the two chambers is that while the House has to find $330 billion in spending cuts, the Senate's Education Committee has to find $1 billion in spending cuts, and that makes for a very different dynamic. What we have seen, and we can talk about it in the questions, is that a lot of the proposals, the risk sharing one I talked about, the elimination of Grad Plus loans, they were almost certain to happen in the House because the House had that big number to hit. They had to put everything into the mix. The Senate has a very small number. They basically have the freedom to look at the things they want to do, where they think good policy could occur. They're less, by all accounts, interested in risk sharing proposals. They're less interested in completely eliminating Graduate Plus. They might want to reform graduate borrowing. There's a lot of concerns about the Grad Plus program from Democrats and Republicans alike in Congress. So that's an area where changes might be made, but they're less dramatic changes than what we've seen proposed in the House. That will be the next big step when we see what happens in the House and whether they can, cross all those hurdles Bill sort of astutely identified with narrow margins and big divides among moderates and conservatives within the Republican ranks. If they get that bill to the finish line and it goes to the Senate may have a very different take entirely, even on what the House could agree to. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and kick it back to you, Tim.
If you have questions as you go forward, please get in touch with us. You can send an email to agr@adea.org, and that will show up in my inbox and the rest of the AGR team. So we'll let everybody. We'll give you a little time back, which is always valuable. So thank you very much, Bill. Thank you very much, John. And thank you all for joining us, and we will we'll see you in the next quarter. Thank you very much. Goodbye.